Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel. Today I got some messages from some followers that a bunch of my TikTok videos had been used in a video from another creator here on YouTube, Celia Tattooer, who is making a video about some of the recent drama on TikTok about paid versus unpaid apprenticeships. Now in her video she did address some different points both on the pro paying your apprenticeship side and on the negative side of paying your apprenticeship. But throughout the entire video she talked about how grateful and happy she is to have an unpaid apprenticeship and ended the video with this.
With that, I honestly don't really know where I stand on if tattoo apprenticeships should be paid or not. I definitely see arguments for both sides, and I understand that it's just such an unregulated industry and it's so hard when so many people are stuck in these old ways.
So since she's still unsure where she stands, and since I know there's a lot of people out there who are unsure where they stand, let's take a closer look and let me make some more points about why I believe firmly tattoo and piercing apprenticeships, and basically any apprenticeships, should be paid.
And Lynn brings up a great point in that video that you have to be in an incredibly privileged position to take on a full-time job where you're not being paid for a year. And
I am so glad that you liked some of the points that I had to make about privilege when it comes to apprenticing and apprenticeship systems. I think, however, that your video kind of glosses over a lot of elements of privilege when it comes to being able to get into these industries. So let's take a little bit of a closer look using Celia's situation as an example. So I took a quick peek at your Instagram, and you are currently apprenticing at Timeless in Los Angeles, California. Now, I did some quick looking online, and the hourly living wage for LA is $21.22. Minimum wage in LA is $15.50, and $6.53 counts as poverty wages in LA. So in this situation, we're talking about an unpaid apprenticeship. So you are expected to work completely for free, completely without pay, typically around 5 days a week. Now in Celia's situation, she not only is not being paid, but paid for her apprenticeship. And we are going to get into a little bit more of that later, but I would like to just look at the unpaid apprenticeship aspect of this first. Now, if someone were living in LA, the median rent there right now is $3,269. Now, that's the median rent for living in LA proper. Many folks who are apprenticing, even if they were being a paid apprentice, could probably not afford to live in LA. They probably live somewhere outside of LA. But the average rent for California is still just shy of $2,000 for a one-bedroom, coming in at $1,956. Energy bills average $195 every single month in California. Phone bills are usually $210, and groceries in this state are 11% more expensive. So just as a baseline, cost of living in or around LA to be apprenticing in a studio like this, incredibly, incredibly high. So if we are to assume in this situation that we are working as an unpaid apprentice, we have to work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, unpaid. How are we going to afford to live? Now, there's some people who are going to have family members who are willing to pay for their rent, cover their expenses, make things easier for them while they're trying to get this figured out. Super awesome if you have the privilege to have family members who are willing to pay for you to live in LA and have an apartment and live this life while you're trying to get into the industry. That is also incredibly, incredibly privileged. So let's take a look at this from the situation of someone who doesn't have family members they can rely on and needs to be responsible for themselves financially. Right off the bat, we're working as an unpaid apprentice, but we have bills to pay, so we need to get a second job. In this hypothetical scenario, we find a decent second job that is going to pay us maybe not a thriving wage, but at least minimum wage. Now, in order to be able to afford the very high cost of living in LA, we have to work at that second job full-time. So right now we spend 40 hours a week at work at the studio doing our apprenticeship tasks, cleaning the studio, trying to learn all of this stuff. And then we're going to spend another 40 hours a week working at our second job that's paying for our bills and allowing us to survive as an apprentice. So off the bat, we have 80 hours of work every single week. Now we have to get to and from 2 different jobs, and LA traffic is notoriously bad. So if you live kind of close to where you're working, you probably have about 14 hours of commuting to do every week if you commute 2 hours a day. But again, median rent in LA is over $3,000, so most folks probably aren't privileged enough to afford to live in LA. They're living somewhere further where they're gonna have more commuting time. That's gonna put us at about 21 hours a week of just commuting, taking public transit, driving, getting back and forth from all of our jobs. Then we're probably gonna spend about 10 hours a week on household tasks. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, all of this other stuff. And goodness knows, food and groceries in LA, especially eating out, is incredibly expensive, by at least 10% more than the rest of the country. So our hypothetical apprentice probably can't afford to eat out that often, so they need to spend time cooking for themselves, meal prepping, making sure they have food to eat. So we've got another 10 hours every week on regular tasks, regular chores. Then we've got about 10 hours a week of apprenticeship homework, because apprenticeships usually don't end when you finish your shift. Especially for tattoo apprentices, you're usually going home and practicing drawing flash. You're an artist, you gotta make art, you gotta practice in order to be good enough to tattoo. So we're gonna say you're spending about 10 hours every week on this. Oh, I also forgot that you need to sleep. Now, this apprentice is working 2 jobs, they live in LA, their life is stressful, they are probably not getting 8 hours of sleep every night. So let's say that you get about 6 hours of sleep every night. That puts you at 42 hours of sleep a week. This leaves us with a whopping 15 to maybe 22 hours of free time every single week. This does not account for needing to take public transit, so having longer commute times. It doesn't account for any time need to be spent on religious practices, spiritual practices, time with family. This certainly doesn't account for any time if you have children. If you're someone who is disabled, this doesn't account for any time to take care of your disability, access medical care or health care. In fact, this equation doesn't even include the costs of health care, let alone the time to go see doctors, see people, get help that you need. This is the type of schedule that you expect someone to work for 1 to 2 years in order to become a tattoo artist or a body piercer when we're looking at unpaid apprenticeships. And not only are they expected to work this back-breaking schedule for years on end, but they're expected to learn an entire new trade while they do this, and a trade where they're working on people's bodies. Now, apprentices in general are going to make mistakes. No one is going to be perfect right off the bat. That's why they're learning. But when I think about the type of apprentice that I want to have working on my body while they're training, I'd really like someone who got a full 8 hours of sleep, who was able to go home and dedicate time to studying and learning and absorbing the information they learned the previous day from their mentor to really properly prepare for my tattoo or my piercing. I'd like to have someone tattooing me who is able to afford to eat regularly and eat nourishing meals, so their hands are going to be steady, so their mind is sharp, so their body feels ready to work. And maybe I'm just crazy, but I think that even if you are apprenticing and learning a trade, you deserve to have enough free time to have a social life, see your friends, be in a relationship, actually live life. I don't think there is any reason why, in order to become a tattoo artist or a body piercer, you have to completely give up any quality of life and work an absolutely unrealistic schedule between 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to be able to afford to do this. And I don't think this creates a situation where apprentices are able to give 100% of their energy to learning this trade and learning this craft. I would much rather have a well-rested, well-fed, well-nourished, focused, confident apprentice working on me than someone who's barely slept 6 hours, is worrying about getting to work the next night and where their next meal is going to come from or how they're going to afford rent. So just as an initial argument, when we look at the amount of privilege that has to exist for someone to be able to physically endure this type of schedule and work like this, or the amount of privilege someone has to have to not have to work like this, to be able to work unpaid 40, 50, 60 hours a week and have someone else footing the bills for things, or roommates they can rely on, or extra money somewhere, that is an absurd amount of privilege. And I honestly feel like Celie's original video really glosses over just how privileged it is to work unpaid like this. I really feel like when we look at the numbers and we look at how much time and effort it would actually take someone to be able to afford to do this without mommy and daddy or friends and family helping pave the way for them, it is an absurd amount of work for one person to have to be doing, especially while learning a new career. Not to mention, the vast majority of the apprenticeships I've ever seen, I've ever been through, I've ever spoken to other people about are not exactly great apprenticeships. It's not like you are spending these 40 hours a week in the studio just learning and drawing all of the time. Apprentices are usually being made to sweep, mop, set up, break down, answer phones, book customers, post on social media, create content, take pictures. They're expected to go pick up lunch, go run out and drive and get supplies for the studio. I've known more apprentices than I can count who are expected to pick up their mentors' kids from school, pick up their medication, go out and get them the beer that they need for their party after work. Apprentices are frequently treated as the shop bitch in most studios, and they're doing an insane amount of grunt work that oftentimes crosses the line from work that's being done for the business to just personal work for the tattoo artists. And it's considered totally normal because you're just paying your dues. Now, not every apprenticeship is like this, but I feel very confident in saying the vast majority of them over the last decade have been, and many of them today still are. When we talk about the drama on TikTok that started this whole debate with Matt and Bouncing Blueberry, Matt's previous apprentices have come forward and said they spent all of their time creating content for him for social media and for the studio, and very little time actually drawing, observing him tattoo, and learning how to tattoo. So our hypothetical apprentice in this situation is working this absolutely miserable schedule, giving up having a life for years on end for what is actually a very small amount of education and mostly just doing a lot of labor for the studio. And this is labor that qualifies as being an employee. See, the other really big point whenever we talk about paid versus unpaid apprenticeships, especially when it comes to tattoo artists, is a lot of people like to argue, oh, well, they're independent contractors, so they're not employees, it doesn't matter, we can make them work totally for free. And first of all, why are we trying to justify people working for free? That's the weirdest thing to me. But secondly, most tattoo artists are not actually independent contractors by law with how their studios are run, but especially not apprentices. Like, I honestly think that 80% of independent contractor tattoo artists and body piercers are being 1099 so their studios can avoid paying full taxes on having them as employees. And by the way, tax fraud and wage theft is one of the largest forms of theft in the country. If y'all think this is only happening with big greedy corporations, you are totally wrong. Wage theft and tax fraud is happening all the way down to the smallest independent businesses, including tattoo studios and piercing studios. But when we talk about apprentices, if we look at their type of employment, fall under the guidelines of employees in the vast majority of situations when we look at IRS guidelines and when we're talking about the United States of America, which is where we're located. Let's take a look at the requirements for an independent contractor versus an employee from the IRS. Does the company control or have the right to control what the worker does and how the worker does the job? That's the first thing that it asks for differentiating between independent contractor and employee. And I'm not even talking about when the apprentice is being told how they tattoo. If the studio or the mentor is telling the apprentice, you have to sweep, mop, and clean these things these days, this is how I want you to do it, I want you to take these pictures for social media, and this is how I want you to post it, that's employment. That is an employee being given tasks by an employer. That is not an independent contractor who is operating and doing things on their own. Does the company control the business aspects of the worker's job? These include arrangements like how the worker is paid, whether expenses are reimbursed, and who provides tools and supplies. This can also extend to the hours an employee is expected to work. And absolutely, studios and mentors control all of those things when it comes to their apprentices. And then this one's really good. Is there a written contract or employee benefits such as a pension plan, insurance, or vacation pay? Well, there's usually some form of written apprenticeship contract when it comes to having an apprentice, and that contract usually goes over details of how the apprentice is expected to work, tasks they're expected to do around the shop, and how long their apprenticeship is expected to take. This is often by law considered an employment contract. Now, when we look at how apprentices are legally supposed to be paid, there's lots of variations on how that pay can be. Apprentices can be paid a minimum wage or a lower wage for the full time they're working, or they can be paid for when they're doing labor that is the labor of an employee and unpaid while they're doing educational work. So for an example, if an apprentice is expected to come in for a full 8-hour shift and they're going to spend 4 of those hours sweeping, cleaning, mopping, and creating content for social media, and then another 4 hours directly observing their mentor tattoo, it's considered fair in a lot of states and with a lot of laws for the apprentice to only be paid for 4 hours of work that day at minimum wage, because those are the hours where they were doing labor for the business. So it's not necessarily that apprentices are getting paid to just sit around and learn, but they're being paid for the labor that they're doing that replaces the labor of an employee in a studio. And because I know a lot of studios also try and 1099 their front of house staff, front of house is employees. You want to try and make the argument for tattoo artists, whatever, but front of house are 100% employees, counter staff are 100% employees, and oftentimes it is the labor of those employees that is what apprentices are doing as part of their apprenticeship. And not only that, this has also held up in court. I've talked to multiple people who have successfully sued their studios for unpaid wages and tax fraud for not paying them throughout their apprenticeships. And guess what? They've won. So there is a legal precedent that these laws do apply to the tattoo and piercing industry. Just because this industry is loosely regulated and just because a lot of people in it have a very loose and poor understanding of labor laws, employment laws, and tax laws, doesn't mean that those laws magically don't apply to them. Now, there's a couple other points in the original video that I'd like to get into.
There's so many stories of people who have incredibly abusive apprenticeship experiences. And Lynn themselves also had a horrible piercing apprenticeship. And that's unfortunately more common than you might think. And it's really disappointing that that's the way the industry has been for so long. And it's so normalized to treat your apprentice like shit.
I do really appreciate that she acknowledged that abuse definitely exists in the industry. As anyone who follows me knows, I've been very open in talking about the abuse that I've experienced in my apprenticeships. But what really made me upset about this video is that it takes absolutely no accountability for the level of which unpaid apprenticeships further systems of abuse within the industry. And in fact, saying at the end of your video that you're just not sure where you stand, but you're really grateful for your unpaid apprenticeship is kind of encouraging this same harmful, problematic system, especially since you don't really address how much unpaid apprenticeships contribute to systems of abuse. Now, when we look at abuse and domestic violence, financial abuse is one of the most insidious and difficult to escape forms of abuse, and elements of financial abuse are what can keep victims of domestic violence trapped in those violent situations for years and years on end. They have no control of their own finances, no access to money to be able to leave, no freedom, and they're completely dependent on their abuser for any form of money, and that means being dependent for food, medicine, shelter, all of these things. When apprentices work completely unpaid, they enter a system of financial abuse where they are either forced to work unrealistic schedules, as we've already looked at, or be completely dependent upon their mentors and their studios for where their next meal is going to come from and how they're going to survive. And for decades, predatory people have been abusing this system in the industry. They find young folks, typically female and feminine presenting folks, and give them the amazing chance to live their dream and become a tattoo artist or body piercer. But of course, they're gonna work unpaid because that's how it's always been. They gotta pay their dues and show that they want it. But this mentor has a heart of gold, so the apprentice can live with them for free, and they don't have to worry about paying for housing, and they don't have to worry about paying a bunch of bills, and now they only have to worry about affording food and gas and getting to and from work. Now, of course, in these situations, it's usually like an 18 to 23-year-old woman or feminine presenting person and like a 30 to 40-year-old mentor. And if you're already thinking that 18 and 19-year-olds moving in with 30 and 40-year-olds in mass in order to work with them unpaid for 5, 6, 7 days a week sounds like a really terrible situation that leads to grooming, abuse, and violence, you would be absolutely correct. And having spoken to literally hundreds of survivors of abuse like this, myself being one of them, one of the number one reasons why people didn't leave, why they stayed at abusive studios, why they stayed in abusive and dangerous situations, was because they couldn't afford to. They didn't make enough money, they were barely able to keep a roof over their head, they were very thoroughly trapped at this studio, forced to stay in a situation that was very dangerous and very unsafe because they didn't feel like they had any way out. And unpaid apprenticeships directly contribute to trapping impressionable young people in very, very dangerous situations of abuse. This can range from mentors who become romantically involved with their apprentices, have inappropriate relationships, and completely control and manipulate their life, to just mentors who suck, who emotionally abuse, yell at, scream, belittle their apprentices, or sometimes physically abuse their apprentices. Throw things at them, hit them, force them to do unreasonable things around the studio if they make a mistake or mess up. Why, just the other day, me and my coworker were comparing the apprenticeship tattoos that we were forced to get at the studios we worked at because we were branded as the studio's property since we were their apprentices. And this is still very common practice within both the tattoo and piercing industry. There are still hundreds, if not thousands of people trapped in very abusive situations that are enabled by unpaid apprenticeships. So to mention in a few throwaway lines in your video that yes, there's abuse in the industry, it happens more often than you'd think and it sucks, but still come out of your video saying, I don't know if I think apprentices should be paid, is so heartbreaking to me as a survivor of this abuse, because so many survivors have been speaking up about how having financial freedom and independence and being paid for our labor could protect and prevent this kind of abuse from occurring. But instead, the industry just collectively goes, yeah, there's a lot of abuse, it sucks, but we've always done it this way.
And this attitude is normal in the tattoo industry, at least from my experience. Every apprentice before me paid for their apprenticeship at the shop that I work at. And if there's apprentices in the future, I'm sure they would be expected to pay and not be paid. And just because it's common doesn't mean that it's right or it's the way that things should be.
You're right. Just because we've always done it this way doesn't make it right, but we don't have to keep doing it this way. And one of the most concrete ways we can improve getting into this industry, we can protect apprentices from abuse and violence, is to pay them. When we give apprentices financial freedom, when we pay them for their labor, and when we create an environment where apprentices can actually focus 100% on learning, where they don't have to be stressed about working 80-hour to 100-hour work weeks or where their next meal is going to come from, we get apprentices who are able to learn faster, who are able to work harder and do more, who are well rested and well fed enough and not completely overstressed about their life, to the point that they can really dedicate 100% of themselves to learning and becoming better tattoo artists, better piercers, and just making the industry better as a whole. For more information on these practices, please check out safepiercings.org apprenticeship guidelines, which cover things like red flags to watch out for, what apprentices deserve, and information about safe wage and safe apprenticeships. I'm also going to link in the comments down below different videos that I have done going over the legalities and the ethical issues surrounding unpaid apprenticeships, as well as some blog posts I've written about this subject as well. See, our generations have the opportunity to change this practice and be the ones who stand up and say, it doesn't have to always be this way. And I hope this video helps you see why apprentices, including yourself, absolutely deserve to be paid for their labor. I look forward to hearing what y'all think about this one in the comments, and have a great rest of your night. Bye!